off, these have been out for a few weeks, and I haven't actually explained to everyone what they are. So at the back, we've got a few of these little books, which are basically just little gospel introductions for unbelievers. There's a why, what is Christianity? There's a Gospel of John, and there's why are we here? And they are just free, and when they go, I can get more. And if you have people who are interested in the gospel, or you know that you tend to, you are on your time out and about, you meet people and like, oh, I'd like to give them something. I get into conversation, I'd love to give them something, little short, it takes 5-10 minutes to read. These are just ideal for that. So take them if they're for you, if there's something that you think you'd be able to use, benefit from. And this, a little bit bigger, is a book called Reason for God, which is also free if you'd like to take one. It is by a guy called Tim Keller, who is a guy who leads a church in New York, Manhattan, and he's written this book, and it's basically a book just opposing arguments to why God exists. He's not trying to convince you to become a Christian. What he's trying to do is make you question more than anything. So what he does brilliantly is he takes worldly concepts and ways that most of your friends who aren't Christians believe, and then he follows them through to their logical end and shows you how they are folly. And so if this would be a great book you can take, you can bring back, you can give away. If you find yourself, you've got people come with you, questions, and you're like, I just don't know how to answer them. I want to be better equipped. This would be a great book for you. But also, if you've got someone in your life who is on that kind of journey and they're thinking, I'm not a Christian, I'm not really sure whether I want to be a Christian, but they're open to the debate. This might be a sort of book that you might want to give them and say, well, why don't you give this a read? So yeah, these are there. They're free to take to help bless you in sharing with your friends and family. But other than that, let's get on with today's message. So we are continuing in our series, going through the series from the beginning of the Bible to the end of the Bible, looking at this theme, royal priests. Remember, we started off with Adam and Eve, the original priestly kings and queens in their Eden temple, serving God until they decided they knew better, they were going to do things on their own, and they lose paradise, they get kicked out. Remember, generations come, generations go. We arrive to this guy named Abraham, who God says to Abraham, that God calls Abraham out. He gives Abraham and Sarah a new identity. He gives them new names. He calls them out. He says that from you, actually, that when Adam and Eve were kicked out of paradise, God didn't leave it at that. He gave them hope. And he said that one day a king would come, a king of kings, a priest, a great high priest, a sacrifice would come and make a way so that everyone could come back and know God, know him, be re-identified as his. And we meet Abraham and Sarah. They're not that, but they get re-promised. They get told, actually, but this will happen through you. And generations come, generations go, and then we get to Moses, remember? And we talked about Moses last week, how that God's people were in slavery, and the people cry out, and God answers their prayers by sending Moses. He sends Moses, he calls out Moses from the burning bush, and he declares that Moses should go and speak to Pharaoh and see the people set free. And Moses has that attitude which we often have, which I'm praying against, which is, that's great, God, send someone else. I think that's where he goes, he makes up all these excuses to why he shouldn't be the one to go to Pharaoh to speak. And eventually, he goes with his brother Aaron, and God does amazing miracles and signs through them, and then it's culminating in leading the people out, Egyptians chasing them, the sea in front of them, and God parts the Sea of Reeds, and they walk through. And then they spend the majority of what is Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers at the foot of Mount Sinai, the mountain of God, which, as we looked at last week, it was a big, scary mountain with God's presence on it, which was fiery and lightning and smoke. It made the people kind of terrified. And God kind of says to them, I want you to be a nation of priests. And he says, come up the mountain. Come up the mountain. And the people, in the same spirit as Moses go, no, thank you. Moses, you go up instead. That's scary. We might die. And so Moses, you go up. And I said, and remember, Moses goes up the mountain. And whilst he's up the mountain, the people, I think maybe the people thought that he died or whatever. But anyway, the people then decide, right, they're going to worship something else. They're going to worship that golden calf. And sadly, what happens is they go from, really, a nation, God calling them to be a nation of priests, to a nation with priests. Because Moses comes down, he intercedes for the people after they've been stupid and wanted to praise another god. And God sets up the Levitical priestly line. And Moses gets from God this template of how he's going to create the tabernacle, this kind of mini Eden, this where God's presence will dwell amongst the people. And they build it. They have this big celebration, this 7-day celebration. This is all in Leviticus. And then at the end of the 7-day celebration, God's presence comes down the mountain, and a pillar of smoke fills the tent. And what happens is that this is kind of a picture of a mirror of Genesis, the 7-day creation story. This is like the 7-day creation of this new nation. But sadly, just like Genesis, where you only go to the next chapter and they mess up, you don't go too far, and then you've got Aaron's sons come into the temple and decide, we don't want to do things God's way, we're going to do things our way. And they get burnt up, they die. And actually, I'm going to shelve that because we're going to come back to that, because something very similar is going to happen in the story of David that we're going to look at. But ultimately, what we see is the priesthood doesn't get off to a great start, and it never really ever gets to a great place. And that's one of the great things about the Bible, okay? One of the great things about the Bible. See, if you read the Bible, the Old Testament, okay, the Old Testament would have been circulated, would have been preached on, would have been taught on by the priests. And if you read it, the priests aren't set in a very good light. Think of the same of the New Testament, okay? The church, the first leaders of the church were the disciples. They don't come off in a very good light if you read the Gospels, do you? And now you think, if people wrote this, if people came up with the idea of God, then they would surely erase some of the stupid stuff that they did. But no, they lay it out there, because the Bible time and time again shows that there are no heroes. We're all idiots. We all make mistakes. But Jesus is the one true hero of the story. And so generations come, generations go, and ultimately the people get so frustrated. We get to the prophet Samuel, the last judge. And the people are just like, we don't want priests to lead us. We don't want judges to lead us. What we want is a king like everyone else. And Samuel kind of takes that to heart, like, oh, does that mean you don't like me anymore? And God's like, that's not an insult against you, it's an insult against me. Right, let them have what they want. Let them have what they want. So they take this guy Saul to be their king. And Saul looks externally every part a king. He's big, he's muscular, he can fight, he can speak. He's what everything like you look for on a CV for a king. But the problem is that as you read through Saul's life, he wasn't a man who God looked for in a king, what God looked for in a king. See, he got his identity, and that's what one of the things that we've been talking about over this series. He got his identity upon what others thought about him, on how others thought he was. He wasn't secure in who God, the Creator, was. And so God says to Samuel, I'm choosing a man of my own. I'm choosing a man after my own heart. And what we see is that he chooses a guy named David, who we're going to talk about today. And David, if we look through David's life, I'm going to zoom through David's life, and he has many highs, quite a lot of lows. But what we see is David truly is this man. He's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but he is a man who is after God's own heart. He is secure in who God is. He knows who his God is. and he knows who God has called him to be. And that's what I want for us as a church. You see, David comes onto the scene when Samuel was told by God to go to the house of Jesse. And he said, from Jesse's sons, I'm going to proclaim that there is going to be a new king in Israel. And so Samuel goes to the house of Jesse, and he looks at all of Jesse's sons, and Jesse's kind of got all his boys out, and they're big, they're strong, they all look the part, and Samuel goes up to each one after the other, and every single one, God goes, not him. Okay, the next one, not him. All right, this one, not him. This one, surely God has got in, not him. And he goes through all of them, and each one, God says, not him. So Samuel has to then go to Jesse and say, is there anyone else? I mean, I've looked at all these guys, but God says no. But he definitely told me that one of your sons was going to be the next king. And Jesse's like, well, there's David. I mean, but, we don't get him out in front of polite company. We stick him in the field. I'm sure you've all got someone like that in your family. You want to keep... So when people come over, you're like, okay, maybe they need to go over there. But no, seriously, David is that. David is that person. Whilst they're there, they have the most important person in the land is over at their house. David has been sent out into the field to look after sheep. You see, David didn't exactly what you would call have a 5-star upbringing. Okay, if you read David's early life, he didn't exactly have a life which kind of leads you to think that this is a man who's going to be secure in who he is, have good self-esteem, a man who's going to be secure in who he is as a person. No, this man is, this man, he's treated as a runt. He's cast out to the side. This guy probably has some serious, you would have thought, emotional damage from the way his family would treat him. But anyway, he is called. He is brought before all his brothers, his dad, and Samuel comes to him, and God says, this is the one. This is my man. And he anoints him as king. Can you imagine that? You're the runt. No one in your family thinks anything of you, but then all of a sudden, you're told you're going to be king one day. But that doesn't last too long because his family don't treat him any differently. I can imagine if it was any of the other sons. This is David's family is like Joseph's family, but in reverse. You remember how Jacob had all these kids and he was like, kids. But Joseph, I love you, Joseph. Jesse was kind of like, strikes me the guy, I have these sons, I love these boys. No, David. It's just like complete reverse. But so you would have thought, if it was any of the other sons, he'd be like, all right, you sit down, you have the best seat in the house, you do no more work, your other brothers will serve you, will tend on you, because you're going to be king one day. You're going to be, have you met my son? He's going to be king one day. No, not David. Not David. He's treated again like a nobody. He's sent to errands. He has to work for his brothers. And he gets spoken down to so much by his brothers. It ends up with this point in 2 Samuel where David exacerbatedly says, "What have I done now? What have I done?" As he goes to his brothers, and his brothers just kind of glare at him. But then the day comes. His dad has given him some food, an important message to take to his brothers who are serving the king on the front line they're fighting against the Philistines, their enemies. And he goes there, he goes to the front line, and as he's there, he sees the Philistine army line up, and from the ranks of the Philistine army, this giant Goliath comes out and bellows at them. He insults them. He mocks them. He calls them weak. He calls them pathetic. He says that they're good for nothing. He basically says, I could beat your whole army with my hands tied behind my back, blindfolded. And David looks around at his brothers and the rest of the army, and they're quaking in their boots, literally going, he's right. He could. Look at him. He's massive. And David's like, but David is a man who is secure in who God is. You see, and he knew, even when he was out on the hillside, being treated as nothing, He meditated on the word of God and therefore knew who God was, what Yahweh was like, and what Yahweh had called him to be. When he had his brief moment in the spotlight as future king, it didn't go to his head because he didn't take upon himself what others said about himself. He took on himself what God said about him. When he was being treated as the runt of the family, he didn't look to what people said about him, what people said over him. He knew what God said about him. And now here, as the giant is there, with his human eyes, he's looking, big guy, could defeat an whole army. But the reality is he knows who his God is. And he knows it doesn't matter how big that guy is. He could have been another 5 foot taller. He could have weighed several more 100 pounds. It doesn't matter because he's on God's side. And God's far bigger than anyone else. And so he, with the boldness, knowing who God is, where everyone else is quaking in their boots, he declares in front of the army, who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he may defy the armies of the living God? And the other guys look at him and go, who are you to say that? He's like, no, my God, I may be small, but my God is bigger. And so what happens is he convinced the king to let him go out and fight. I think the king thinks we're going to die anyway, so might as well let this guy go. And he wins. He throws that stone, it hits Goliath in the head. Goliath comes tumbling down, and David goes from instantly nothing to national hero. He becomes the biggest celebrity in the land. People start writing songs about him. People start telling legends about this guy. People are, everywhere you go, the minstrels and the songwriters and the playwrights, they're writing stuff about David. And so much so, actually, that Saul starts to get jealous, doesn't he? Because Saul's rooted, Saul finds his identity in how the others think that he is ruling as a king. And he can't handle the fact that David is getting more praise than him. And so David then one day goes from the Lord, the giant slayer, to fugitive. Overnight, he becomes a fugitive. Saul wants him dead because Saul is jealous of him. And he throws that spear at him. David runs. And he spends years in the wilderness on his own. But still, he knows who God is and who God has called him to be. Do you know who God has called you to be? Do you know who he says you are? Because David, even in the wilderness, we see that because of his character, because of his secureness in God, he gathers a group round him. People who look at him and see a man worth following. He doesn't grasp for that, but he gets it because he knows who God is and he knows who God has called him to be. His identity isn't found in what others have said over him. His identity is found in what God has said over him, what Yahweh has identified him to be. So let me ask you, do you know who God says you are? Just have a look at that. That's what God says you are. It's just a small glimpse of what God says you are. He says you are a friend. He calls you friend. He says you are redeemed, that he has bought you at a price. He says you are a son, you are an heir to the kingdom. He says he chose you. It's not accidental that you're with him. He chose you. He says you are not just a friend, though. He adopted you into his family. He makes you his. You are forgiven. And he says you belong to him. He made you. He formed you. He has a plan for you. He loves you. You see, and Saul dies eventually, and David becomes king, doesn't he? David becomes king, and the first thing David does as king is he sets up Jerusalem as his new capital. And then what he does is, because David is a man after God's own heart, he loves God so much, he wants God's presence. He's jealous of God's presence. He says, I want the Ark of the Covenant. Remember that thing that Moses was commissioned to make however many years ago? God's manifest presence with them. He says, I want the Ark of the Covenant with me to come to where I am. And see, what had happened is while Saul was king, Saul had the Ark of the Covenant, and he'd kind of used it. Rather than, this is the presence of God, he'd used it as kind of a good luck charm. You know, if I say the right words, if I do the right thing, if I act a bit good, if I rub the lamp the right way, you know, I'll get what I want. And God didn't like that, surprise, surprise. And so actually, one day, they carry the ark into battle. They're not bothered about God. They're just bothered about if they've got the ark, they'll win. And God says, no. And he withdrew his presence from Saul, and the ark gets captured. And then there's a funny story. The Philistines taking it to their temple, and their temple bows down to the ark and all that kind of stuff. And anyway, lots of bad stuff happened to the Philistines. And ultimately, they decide they're going to get rid of the ark, and they leave it on the border of their territories. But no one goes and gets it. So David's first act as king, he says, I'm going to go and get that. I want God's presence with us. So we're going to read 2 Samuel chapter 6. It says, David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000, and David arose and went with all his people who were with him from Baal-Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who sits enthroned on the cherubim. And they carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill of Uzziah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, where we were driving the new cart with the ark of God. And Ahio went before the ark, and David and all the house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. And when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzziah put his hand out to steady the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzziah, and God struck him down there because of his error. And he died there beside the ark of God. And David was angry because the Lord had broken out against Uzziah. And that place is called Perez Uzziah to this day. And David was afraid of the Lord, and he said, how can the ark of the Lord come to me? So, like, it's kind of a downer, you know, all this excitement. And then this happens. I mean, David wants the ark. He brings it to him. They get a new cart, which, by the way, they weren't meant to. There was holes in the side, which the priests were meant to carry the ark on poles. They put it on a new cart. And as they're celebrating, they're taking this on a new cart down the roads, which are nothing like our roads. It's just a worn path, really. There would have been potholes in unsteadiness, and the oxen stumbles. The wheel on the cart maybe wobbled so much that it looked like the Ark of the Covenant was going to fall off, and it could fall into a puddle. It could have fallen and got dented. The ox could have just pooed, and it could have literally just landed in ox poo. And Isaiah, to his horror, thought God's presence cannot land in ox poo. So he puts out his hand to steady it, and God strikes him down dead. I mean, how do you feel? How does it make you feel that Uzziah is killed? You know, how does it make you feel? You know, going back to Aaron's sons, that they were killed when they decided that they were going to do things their own way. I mean, he was trying to save the ark from getting dirty. I mean, we have a dog, Nala, and I take her for a walk every day. And you know, over the past few weeks, it's been less rain. Obviously, it's been chucking it down yesterday on enough, but generally less rain. So she loves to swim. But the streams and kind of the ponds and the puddles that she loves to swim in, they're less puddles and more mud now. That does not stop her. She disappears for a second. She comes out, this golden, beautiful lab comes out, black, muddy, covered from head to toe, filthy. And not only that, she stinks of pond water, stale pond water. It's disgusting. And do you know what else she does? Okay, this is gross. I mean, those of you who've got cats will know this. But she'll see. And she doesn't bring like dead animals in. But like if you've got cats, try and impress you or whatever. But she'll see, like, you're walking in the field and she'll see like a dead bird and she'll think, oh, perfume. Fox poo is the worst. It's gross. Gross. I mean, our kids have got top trumps. You heard top trumps. You know, our kids have got animal poo top trumps. You know, they're all rated on smelliness, messiness, consistency, all that kind of stuff. It's gross. But let me say, okay, and we can look at it and think the Ark of the Covenant was going to get covered in poo. That's the worst thing that could possibly have happened to God's presence. No, it's not. No, see, it doesn't matter. Whatever you think is the most smelly, disgusting thing that you could get on you, okay? It is nothing compared to your sin. Your sin, our sin, is vastly, infinitely more vile and putrid smelling to our God than any stinky poo or whatever you can imagine. And Uzziah didn't realize that. That's what he forgot. You see, he treated God with contempt, that he could just walk up and touch God. I was doing a good deed, I was trying to touch him, but we can so often treat God with contempt. I mess up, I sinned, doesn't matter, God will forgive me. You forgive me, right, God? It's your job. Of course you'll forgive me, it doesn't matter. Do I even need to say sorry? No, God just forgives. God's a God of love, isn't he? He's a God of love. 1 John 4 says, God is love. And if you're loving, that means you have to affirm me. You say that what I'm doing is okay, I'm good, I'm right, everything's fine. No. God is love. God does love you. But God is God, and therefore God gets to decide what love is. God defines God, okay? A God that we define isn't truly God. We are told by him who he is. We don't tell him who he is. And as soon as we start saying, that's good, that's evil, that's loving, that's unloving, that's right, that's wrong, apart from, or we put God on a shelf, we become just like Adam and Eve in the garden, and we end up in a load of trouble. We make a mess of our lives, of those around us, because God is God. You see, God loves you so much. But that doesn't mean that everything we do, he's okay with. It doesn't mean that everything we do is acceptable. So what does that mean? Are we left with a hopeless situation with a God who's angry and doesn't want anything to do with us? No. Let's continue. It says, so David, remember David's angry. He doesn't know what to do. He was not willing to take the ark of the Lord to the city of David, to Jerusalem. But David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. And what a great name. And the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom for 3 months. And the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. You see, Lord blessed Obed-Edom. He showed him grace. Obed-Edom had done nothing. The presence of the Lord had just turned up on his doorstep. I mean, if I was Obed-Edom, at day 1 of those 3 months, I'm thinking, oh my word, someone's just died by being close to this thing, and you're putting it on my doorstep? But the presence of God shows him grace, shows him favor. You see, God loves you. He shows us grace. Grace means that you can mess up and come straight into the Father's house. Grace means that you are always his child. He will never disown you. But guys, let's not mistake grace for entitlement. You see, entitlement robs us of joy. Entitlement says, well, you should forgive me. Do you know what I'm like? Do you know who I am? Of course I deserve to be forgiven. God, the entitlement robs us of the joy, of the wonder of salvation. Whereas grace, which means God's undeserved favor upon us, grace leads us to awe and wonder at how good God is. He says, I'm a mess. I've made a mess of everything but Jesus. But Jesus. You see, what my prayer is for us this morning is that we would rather than start going, well, I'm a vile, smelly thing to God. What my prayer is actually, we would, as a Christian, we would approach the throne of God, start saying actually, well, what's a good smell then? If sin is vile, what is a good smell? What good smells? What's good to God? Because God does say that we can give a pleasant aroma to his nostrils. And we're going to read exactly what that looks like right now. So, it says, and it was told the king, the Lord has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God. So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. And when those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, he sacrificed an ox and a fattened animal. And David danced before the Lord. And David danced before the Lord with all his might. And David was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with a sound of the horn. You see, David gets it. David understands that God's favor is abundant, that he doesn't deserve anything. He doesn't deserve God's favor, but he gets it. He understands. He was reminded again who God is, how great God is, how forgiving, how loving God is, and that God has chosen him, and he loves him, and that he is a son, he is a friend, he is adopted into his family. You see, this was a man who knew what grace in his life looked like. He knew he didn't deserve it, but God had graciously given him, lavished upon him favor. And do you know what that did? That blew his mind. That blew his mind so much that he starts jumping and dancing and leaping for joy. Not to be silly, not to make a scene. Actually, later on in the story, you read that he gets mocked, he gets chastised for doing that. No, he does it because he just can't hold it in anymore. That he understands, his mind is so blown by what God has done for him, that God loves him, that he can't hold it in, and he dances and leaps for joy. You see, when we encounter God, when we realize what he is, who he is, and what he has done for us, who he has made us to be, that can't lead us to phone zombies. You know, that was interesting. Oh, I like that. I'll share that with my friends. Or just, generally, let's be honest. We might think we look cool, but we just don't generally like this. There's nothing wrong with phones, okay? But when we see how good God is, we can't stay there and just be kind of mesmerized by these things, mesmerized by what's on the telly. See, God is so much greater than that. He deserves so much more. It leads to dancing and shouting and singing. Loads of bulls are killed, okay? There's sacrificial implications to that. There's purity stuff about that. But that, all in all, that would have cost an awful lot of money. That would have cost so much money, because when we see how good God is, it leads to singing, dancing, joy. It leads to extravagant giving as well. Extravagant giving. It also sometimes it will lead to times where we sing, where we start making up new songs that God has given us. You see, when we read the Bible, I don't know if you guys who didn't grow up in England have heard of this term, but in England we kind of have this term of if you spend your time with God, you call it your quiet time. I don't know if you guys have heard of this, but I think it's a very English thing, okay? Because when you read the Bible, they don't have quiet times. You read Acts, okay? They're not all there in the upper room going, no, they're declaring how good God is. They're singing songs. They're singing songs they know. They're singing new songs. They're declaring how good God is. Yes, sometimes the presence of God comes so greatly that we don't know what to say. And you might fall on your knees. You might just bow down before him, just overwhelmed. You might weep. You might be compelled to acts of kindness and love towards others. And that's why we love to have times of worship together. Where when we worship, we want to hear spiritual songs. We want to hear tongues. We want to hear God speak to us. Because when we meet with God, that's what overflows from us. And when we worship like that, when we don't care what others think, only what God thinks, when we give extravagantly, when we love one another, draw out of the goodness of God, that is what God says through his prophets is a sweet, beautiful aroma to his nostrils. You see, the goal isn't, we're talking a lot about identity, the goal isn't for us to go, right, I know who God is, and I know who I am. And there we go. Let's go on with my life. No, the goal is, I know who God is. I know who he has made me to be. I want to worship him, therefore. I want to worship him because he is so, so good. I don't want to waste time doing other things. I can't remember when it was, Pete, but last year, at the beginning of last year, Pete brought this word over us as a church from Isaiah 43. And I want to read it. It kind of, for me, and I think for Julian and Andrew as well, it kind of signified a bringing in of kind of a rebirth for our church. That God doing something fresh. And I want to read it to you, but I don't want you to hear it, but I want you to focus on what God says, but then how it ends. So this is God declaring to his people. It says, I am the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, Israel's creator, your king. This is what the Lord says, he who made a way through the sea, a pathway through mighty waters, who drew out the chariots and the horse, and the armies and reinforcements together, and they lay there, never to rise again, extinguished, snuffed out like a wick. Forget the former things. Do not dwell on the past. See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I am making a way in the wilderness, streams in the wasteland. The wild animals honor me, the jackals and the owls, because I provide water in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland to give drink to my chosen. Get this? The people I formed for myself to proclaim my praises. God is a God of the impossible. As we've already heard twice this morning, God is a God who does things where we think there is no way. He makes a way. He is a God who says, you remember those things that went wrong, those ways where you failed, those things that have happened to you. He says, forget that. I am bigger than that. He says, I want a people who know who they are, who know who I am, who therefore worship me. Not because he's a God who's narcissistic and thinks I need everyone to worship me. No, because when we worship him, we're doing what we were created to do. It's the best thing you can possibly do is to worship the King of Kings. See, that's why we want this town, the Fylde Coast, to hear about Jesus. This is why I want, if you meet people, I want you to be able to give them something. I want you to be able to tell them about Jesus, because we're not because we want a bigger church, because we want more numbers, because we want more people worshiping God. We want people worshiping the goodness of God. See, each one of you is a missionary to the Fylde Coast. That's what you are. You are a missionary. You're called to be God's representative to this town, to be sold out. To be sold out, unashamed worshippers of the living Jesus Christ. And David gets this. David gets this. And there's this really interesting thing. This is why I've picked this passage. Is that David is there dancing and singing before the Lord. And what's he doing? He's wearing a linen ephod, which, some people have said like he's half naked or whatever. It's nothing to do with that. A linen ephod is what the priest wore. So he in this now, he is an Old Testament image of what it looks like to be a royal priest. He is an image to us of what it looks like, a glimpse of what it looks like to be a royal priest, to be a future reminder for us of what it means to be a royal priest, to worship the King of Kings, to rule over creation and to love, to live life in worship to the King. And what we know, don't we? We know he messes up. He does some terrible things, and he is just a shadow. He's not the sacrifice. He's not the ultimate King of Kings. But Jesus is. Jesus is the King of Kings. And we know one day, all sin, all sickness, all sadness, all distractions will be no more. And we will worship him forever. And it won't be boring. It won't ever get old. It will be amazing. It'll be glorious forever and ever and ever. You see, John, do you want to come up, or Joel? We're gonna worship just for a few minutes. But what I want is for us. I want us to be a church that is hungry for a glimpse of God. Hungry for a glimpse of who he is. You see, we were made to worship God. We were made to worship him. And I want us to be a church that is hungry to meet with God so much that it spills out. You know, there, Gillian brought that word, and it was over her, but actually I believe it's for all of us, that there are giants. And there are giants which are keeping some of us timid. There are giants that are standing on the hilltop and mocking us and saying, you can't share your faith. Who are mocking you and saying, God doesn't really love you. Who are saying he won't forgive you. And I believe, I want us to pray for one another. I want us to pray and ask God to show us that those giants are defeated. That he is like, and those strongholds, I believe, are going to go. So these guys are going to start playing. And I just want you to raise your hand. Okay, if you've got something in your life that you feel like, you know, this is a giant in my life. This is something that is hindering me. You don't need to tell anyone. Maybe it's a lack of boldness. Maybe it's a lack of I don't know. Maybe it's nothing you don't feel. I don't know. Maybe as God's been speaking. Maybe it's the words brought earlier. You feel God speak to you. I just ask you to raise your hand, and if you're next to them, I'd love you just to pray for them. So let's stand up. You see, we can stand there and think that was nice, or that wasn't. That was a great set of worship, and then just go home. But what I want is for us to be people who respond to God's word. So who wants to respond to God's word? Who believes? Yeah, right. Why don't you, if you feel comfortable, the person next to you, married to them or not, friends, why don't you just turn and just, as the music plays, just pray. Just pray God's blessing over them. You don't need to know anything about their situation. Just pray your blessing over them. And then I'm going to finish with prayer, and these guys are going to lead us in a chorus. So let's pray.